There used to be a tradition years ago where all the faculty would have to give a chapel every year. And Mr. Andert jokes he was the last to have to do this, but we used to do it, and I think Mr. Perney significantly wants to revive the tradition because I think the seniors do a great job, but at the same time, I think it's interesting to hear about the lives of faculty and the way we see things. The chapel I'm about to give, if you had asked me years ago, I would have thought was crazy. I would have never spoken on faith because it seemingly didn't have value to my life. That said, I'm going to talk a lot about myself because I think that's what you all find interesting. But understand that I'm doing this as a means to helping you look into yourself because I think there's a universality in the struggle that we all have with spirituality and faith. So I will begin. I also was put in special ed reading as a first grader because I struggle reading orally, so bear with me, and I'm sorry. Which is shocking, I teach history. So, what is the meaning of life? Where do we go when we die? Why do I exist on this earth at this time? What does existence mean? I'm sure that this is not what you think is the normal thoughts of a 7-year-old child, but I can tell you this is how I spent my childhood. Throughout my life, I'd been plagued by these thoughts, even by the age of 7. During the time, I found it easiest to run from these difficult questions, and most of my life for that matter. As Mr. Hoyt alluded to, unfortunately, these are not questions that I or anybody else knows the answer to. These are the kind of questions that keep one up at night. These are the kind of questions that a lifetime cannot answer. Being a logical person, I finally came to the conclusion sometime in my teen years that life was meaningless, there was no God, and I was a closet atheist, although I faked it, and told people that I believed in God and all those good things just so I didn't freak people out. While, as I said, I'm irrelevant to this story, I hope that in sharing my faith journey, it means that you can find inspiration and hopefully you don't spend 36 years of your life avoiding it as I did. I truly believe that the pursuit of spirituality is the biggest factor in obtaining happiness. I've learned that nothing exists on this earth that can make me happy unless I, in fact, have internal happiness. So you may ask, or not, rhetorical question, how does a former closet atheist transform into a person who now considers spirituality the center of his life? The truth is, I've always been a spiritual person, struggling with the understanding who I am as a person. Now, I'm not meaning to freak you out, but my first memory of my life is actually a spiritual moment. I don't even know if Emma actually knows this. When I was 2 years old, my mom's a cat lady. So I'm sorry, Mr. Schultz, I could give a whole chapel on my frustration with cats, and I have a cat, but my mom's a cat lady, and a cat lady, there was a time in my life I had 50 cats. Well, my mom's prized cat, Violet, who I later killed by not shutting the door, whole nother chapel. In the 1970s, they had this strange fascination with stoves that had switches instead of dials, and my mom's prized cat set the stove on in the middle of the night, and my mom is not a cleaning lady, so she had a pot of grease apparently on the stove. It caught on fire, and I was upstairs in my bedroom, and grease fires are heavily smoke fires, and so what ended up happening is smoke sped through the house. My mom woke up, but by then it was too smoke-filled, she couldn't get to me. To make a long story short, I was dead for 2 minutes. I literally was not breathing, if you can believe that. I know you have to, when you have these things happen to you, you have to make sense of them. My way is humor, so I'm sorry. My neighbor, who is a fireman, revived me, and what matters for spirituality is I can tell you my first memory of my life is literally floating above my boyhood bedroom, looking down on the bedroom, and that's what I remember. And then a few hours later, I woke up in what's the hospital, Hammond St. Margaret's Hospital, in a ventilator room, and I remember my mom being thankful that I was alive. What troubled me for my entire life is that I was 2 years old, so I didn't really have the ability to have a conception of spirituality, God, and this sent me into a mental tailspin, I think, from a young age. And since that day, honestly, aside from being frustrated with my mother's cats, I've had a paralyzing fear of dying because I felt like I had experienced it. As I grew older, I struggled with that fear my entire childhood. I remember asking my dad after hours of thinking, what is the meaning of life? Why am I here now? What happens when we die? My dad, though he's a great mechanic, is not a spiritual man. He looked at me like I was crazy, and his solution, and I'm not kidding, is he signed me up for a bowling league. He told me I should enjoy life and not think about these things, that this is just going to make me unhappy. So I took up bowling, and with my father's urging, because he dreamed of being a professional bowler, I bowled a lot and became a 200 bowler, and it's great, but it didn't really make me happy, to my father's chagrin. Late at night, I could not get these thoughts out of my head. I would lie awake many nights in absolute terror because I could not answer these questions. My greatest terror was that I lived among people who did not think about spirituality and did not have any desire to really deal with these kind of questions. I hoped that they too had these questions, but my dad and my mom apparently found joy in meaningless rituals of life like bowling, Bears football, NASCAR. If you want to know why I watch NASCAR, it's because my dad made me watch it every Sunday, so it's a ritual I have to go through, even though it has no point. And you know, it just merely distracted me, but of course, those thoughts continued in my head. So for the next 20 years, I followed my dad's advice, engaged in the material world's means of happiness, ritualistic consumption. I engaged in entertaining myself. I worked hard and used all of my resources to buy the things that would distract me from thinking about these terrible questions. If I went to church, it was out of ritualism. I merely got confirmed in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church so I could get married. I faked it. I held my tongue on certain questions because they weren't interested in my questions. And so that was my faith experience. I'd go to church with Mrs. Heffron on Sunday because it made her mom happy. Most importantly, I became addicted to video games. When I was alone, I had to be playing video games. And I'm going to read off a list here that's really embarrassing. I probably played 50 seasons of NCAA basketball before they said the NCAA couldn't use players' names to get rich. They used to have games. I played 40 seasons of NFL football, mostly Madden. I played 100 calendar days, 24-hour days of Civilization 3. Unknowingly, I was doing everything that I could to avoid myself and my deepest fears. I became a creature of fear, afraid of losing my job and money for fear that I would not be able to afford these distractions that made my life whole. In 2004, Emma was born. Sorry, Emma, this is your only part here. And stupidly, I thought I could balance my video game addiction with parenting, often inadvertently choosing one more turn of Civ 3. If you know the game, you get it, over feeding Emma, which frustrated Mrs. Heffron like you couldn't believe. I ignored my family because these distractions had become my life. I ate poorly, I slept poorly, and frankly, I was miserable. When it became apparent to me that my family was angry at me, I made changes, but only out of fear of losing them. My self-centered nature always inherently believed that I was right and everyone else was wrong. To be honest, I was angry that I could not play video games and watch television, doing what I had to do just to get back to those distractions. While I changed, it was for the wrong reasons. I failed to accept that my choices were hurting others, and I believed that other people were selfish and criticizing my selfishness, which is kind of ironic, I get it. Strangely, in that period, I still avoided spirituality. I now realize I only distracted myself in a more adult way. I put all my focus in the work and goal of getting ahead. I believed that more money would allow my family to have the things they wanted, which would make them happy. From 2008 to 2014, this is how I lived my life, still ignoring the present, working tirelessly for the next Disney vacation, the next iPhone, retirement. Happiness was always something that would come in the future if I just worked hard enough. Then my vacation for myself ended on my birthday, ironically, June 5th, 2014. As many of you know, and Mrs. Heffron's really mad I'm mentioning this because she does not want this to be her identity, Mrs. Heffron was diagnosed with breast cancer that summer. My 36th birthday was literally the date she discovered her illness. Her courageous battle with cancer is her story, but ultimately it's my story. As a caregiver, I was totally unprepared emotionally for the realization that my wife was mortal. I had always assumed that we had a lifetime to pursue our passions. Now we were looking at the real possibility that our time together may end. During that time, everything that previously distracted me from spiritual questions ceased to have meaning. Mrs. Heffron and Emma can tell you I became weird, as Emma says. I stopped playing video games. I canceled all my sports packages on DirecTV because of my anger with their commercial increases in prices. I even ceased caring about politics until Trump came along because it just got so interesting. Everything that mattered once to me had no meaning. I know that Emma tells people that I became crazy when I went to a mindfulness session at the 2016 TABS conference. The reality is that I went crazy on my 36th birthday. I realized that I was not living because I had been avoiding myself. That December, Mr. Smith was there to tell you I was totally normal when I came out of the conference. I hadn't lost my mind or anything. I found that mindfulness seemed to have appeal to me for a way to find myself. All the realizations about my actions over the last 40 years did not occur in the moment, because that would have been great. I wouldn't have made those mistakes. Instead, they came as a realization through hours of meditation and contemplating my life. Mindfulness opened a door into my spirituality that had been closed for decades. It gave me the opportunity to accept that the fears that had formed an integral part of my life since childhood were normal, in fact, human, and I could now accept them and process them. In the last 4 years, I've come to believe that spirituality is a universal concept. While not Catholic, I truly enjoy Mass. It's just shocking, but I do. Especially the most recent Notre Dame pastors are really interesting. I liked the whole tennis thing. Golf thing was cool. I've come to view my spiritual journey in the same way as the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama views all faiths as unique value sets that are derived from a universal humanistic compassion. Unlike Western secularism, he offers his concept of secularism, which views that different religious systems are not a threat to some religious dogma, but a spiritual guide to try to appeal to people who are lost, and essentially value sets that are designed to appeal to certain groups of people. So the Dalai Lama studies both quantum physics and all of the major religions of the world as part of his duties as a monk. I'm going to read a quote from him, which I think summarizes this, which I found interesting. He says, "There can be two levels of spirituality. One level of spirituality has to do with religious beliefs. In this world, there are so many different people, so many different dispositions. There are," he says, 5 billion. We've had a lot of population growth in 20 years. There are 5 billion human beings, and in a certain way, I think we need 5 billion different religions because there's such a large variety of dispositions. I believe that each individual should embark on a spiritual path that is best suited to his or her mental disposition, natural inclination, temperament, belief, family, cultural background. Now, for example, as a Buddhist monk, I find Buddhism to be most suitable. So myself, I found Buddhism is best. But that does not mean Buddhism is best for everyone. That is clear. It's definite. If I believe Buddhism was the best for everyone, that would be foolish because different people have different mental dispositions. So the variety of people calls for a variety of religions. The purpose of religion is to benefit people, and I think that if we only had one religion, after a while it would cease to have meaning for most people. If we had a restaurant, for instance, and it served only one dish day after day, every meal, the restaurant wouldn't have any customers. People need to appreciate diversity in their food because they have so many different tastes. In the same way, religions are meant to nourish the human spirit, and I think we can learn to celebrate diversity in religions and develop a deep appreciation of a variety of religions. So certain people may find Judaism, Christian tradition, Islamic tradition more effective for them. Therefore, we must respect and appreciate all the different major world religions and traditions. So when asked what I am, I would say I'm a spiritual secularist. What I found to have meaning is I study spiritual intellectuals to help in my own pursuit and take meaning from things that I find interesting and many things I do not. I have become particularly fascinated, as Emma can tell you, with Buddhist philosophy. While I'm merely a novice, I do think it's cool to expose the community to ideas that are outside of our Christian norm set. So I'm going to take Buddhist philosophy. I'm not talking about like practice. I'm just going to talk about philosophical elements that kind of have a universal meaning that the Buddhist faith typically implements. So now that you understand where I am spiritually, I want to share 3 precepts of the Buddhist tradition I found enlightening. 4 years ago, for instance, I was fixed on what Buddhists call the delusion of permanence. Until June 5th, 2014, I was convinced that everything around me was in a permanent state. Mrs. Heffron would always be the beautiful young lady I met in 1994. Emma would always be the 5-year-old child that would always need me. On that day, I was frightened by the reality of impermanence. I have come to realize that I've spent my entire lifetime trying to prevent change when change is the natural order of things. Here are some examples of what Buddhists are talking about. I walked into morning meeting 18 years ago on October 9th, 2000. That's a whole nother story on how I got hired. A funny one, but another one. 18 years later, there are literally only a few people in this room that were Lumiere in 2000. And I'll name them: Mr. Smith, Mr. Andert, Miss Frankel was a student, and me. I don't really think there was anybody else. I know they're office staff, but they wouldn't have been in the meeting. The La Lumiere today is literally only made up of 1% of the La Lumiere of 2000. In many ways it's the same, in many ways it's not. My favorite question from alum, which is a silly question, is how is La Lumiere? And what they mean is it the same as when I was there? And we're supposed to say yes, but the answer is of course it's not. There's hundreds of new people here, and it has the same values, but in essence, as Mr. Perney talks about, we all change it a little bit by every time somebody new comes in here, and that's a healthy institution. The reason this question happens is humanity yearns for the concept of stability, and so for alum coming back here and seeing the high school still the same way it was, in a way validates them, and it's important to them. Take what you call Mr. Heffron. Literally, I'm not the same person that walked in the FAB 18 years ago. Almost every cell that was in my body on that day has died. It's true. That's how life works. It's scary to think about, but it's true. I am comprised almost of an entirely new Mr. Heffron in a physical sense. There are important spiritual lessons to take away from this Buddha foundation, which is called impermanence. The people in our lives are constantly changing. The Mr. Heffron today will not be the Mr. Heffron tomorrow. When we enter relationships, we must understand that the people in our lives will always be changing before us. Thus, the Buddhist definition of love really translates more as acceptance. Mrs. Heffron and I have been together for 23 years, not because of the attraction that somehow led her to begin dating me on February 15th, 1995. I do know the date because I don't want to get hurt. Frankly, I still then and now don't understand what she saw in a teenage boy. I'd never understand why girls date teenage boys because I was an immature idiot. But that is the mystery of humanity. In a spiritual view, many of our relationships in marriage end because our society has lost the meaning of love. Many of us have friends, we do not really love our friends, we like our friends. And in that, I mean, we get enjoyment out of who they are today. But for long-lasting relationships, we must value the person so much that we accept that where they are now and where they're going to go as they change over the course of time. The highlight of Buddhist philosophy at La Lumiere, I think, is the senior video, which is a shocking event for the community, but really shouldn't be. The audience is always shocked at the last part that Mr. Andert does and Mrs. Smith did, where you see how much people have grown. Emma's in big trouble because she was born on this campus, but see how that goes. It's interesting to us that people change, but we don't notice people change because we live now and we think people, and we don't notice change because we don't really note it. And pictures you really just show us how much a freshman changes as to become a senior. And that's people are changing spiritually and emotionally in front of you at the same time. We just don't realize it. The other delusion that plagued the majority of my life is grasping. In Buddhism, this is the disconnect between the present and the self. While grasping for objects is part of the issue, which Isaiah and I talk a lot about, commercialism is really just scratching the surface at what the delusion of grasping means. The heart of what Buddhists are talking about when they say live in the present is non-grasping. And non-grasping is an adherence to living in the present moment without grasping for what is not. So if you are thinking about next period, you in essence aren't really living up to the concept of non-grasping because you're not here, and that's really what they're talking about when they say live in the present. To get what I'm talking about, I'll discuss the Buddhist image of the mind. For Buddhists, the mind is like a river of thoughts. Typically, we spend our lives jumping from thought to thought without regard to the reality that we are actually in the process of thinking. Buddhists argue that what is really meant by grasping is the fact that we are always jumping like lily pads on a river, not really aware of where we're at in the current moment. Our mind is in the process of thinking about the past and future the majority of our lives. For my journey, I can remember this being so miserable at one point many winters ago that I spent much of my waking days thinking about my family's annual March trip to Disney before Emma started school. I knew how many days it was until we left. I checked the weather daily. I dreamed of the trip. Then a funny thing happened when we got to Disney. I spent most of my time worrying about how much longer the trip was and whether or not I'd be able to afford it in the future because my family was having a good time. So in reality, wanting to be happy on the Disney trip, I was unhappy before the trip, during the trip, and after the trip because at no point was I actually experiencing the trip. It was always a concept in my mind that I couldn't possibly live up to. An American mindfulness scholar named John Kabat-Zinn, who is the son-in-law of Howard Zinn of historical fame, argues that the 21st century human only actually spends about 2 to 5% of actual waking moments in the present. Most humans live their entire lives worrying about the past or the future on the river of thoughts. The core of Buddhist philosophy is mental training in the form of meditation so that you can, as they say, swim to the shore and be able to see your thoughts and aware that you're thinking. Being in the present is being on the shore in the mind of your river. Always be aware of where you're at on board and how to get off. In a religious sense, this is what prayer and meditation are about, or journaling if you're more secular. It's just an opportunity to take note of and pay attention to your mind and what it's doing. And I guarantee you, probably most of you right now are not actually in the present because I'm really boring. I appreciate the laughter. The last useful precept, and then I'll let you go on your way, I want to talk about from Buddhist philosophy is the concept of perceptions. And it's not a Buddhist concept, it's pretty universal. I'll quote the great Buddhist philosopher Jewel, who sums it up on her 2015 album cover when she says, picking up the pieces, when she says, what we call reality is actually our perception of it. Jewel hits the core of this Buddhist philosophy. Zen Buddhists actually argue the body has 6 senses, the 5 senses you know, smell, touch, taste, hearing, and the mind. The philosophy argues that we must never consider what we see as absolute reality because our mind is always interpreting what we see to make sense of it. So here's a rhetorical question you don't have to answer. How many Mr. Heffrons exist in this room? According to Buddhists, not 1, 200. Mr. Heffron is different to every one of you, and honestly, Mr. Heffron's different to me. The way I see Mr. Heffron is very different than how all of you see him. As an example, this summer, an alum named Brian Enyinam, who went by Yao when he was here, came to campus. He graduated in 2003. I cannot tell you how wonderful it is to meet alums from the past, so please come back, not like 3 months after you graduate, but like 15 years is really cool. When I met Brian near the Aquinas patio this summer, he said the most shocking thing to me. He said, so do kids still give you a hard time? I looked at him and asked, like, what do you mean? And then it came to me, he explained that I was a young teacher that did not have the respect for students in 2003. And Mr. Smith and probably Ms. Frankel can tell you that. For Brian, I was still a 23-year-old teacher that had a great deal to learn to be proficient or even respected. In my mind, I'm the experienced educator that still has a great deal to learn, yes, but in no way a teacher that any student would dare give a hard time to because you all know I'm a little unstable. In that moment, there literally were 2 different Mr. Heffrons there. For Brian, I was 2003 Heffron. For me, I was 2018 Heffron. So who am I? And this is where I should start singing Les Miserables, but I won't. This is one of the great insights into Buddhist philosophy. The answer in that moment is that I really was both. We must always realize that the way we see people in the world around us is unique to us. While you may adore a person, someone else may hate that person. We live in a society that validates our perceptions as truth. Just watch the news media and their judgment of people and their assumption about perspective being true. We assume that the way we see the world is correct and that anybody who doesn't see that way is stupid, unintelligent, or wrong. The volatile discourse in our politics and the media is solely a product of the false truth of perception. What is the opposite of perception? The Dalai Lama says compassion. He argues, and I agree with him, that pessimism and judgment are not the nature of humanity. Compassion is the nature of humanity. While humanity has been plagued by wars and conflicts, I'm going to get all historical on you, we ultimately rose out of the plains of Africa with compassionate cooperation. Our history as a species and our ability to move out of the trees of Africa was built upon cooperation. Every great human achievement was done through cooperation. While none of us can control the state of the affairs in the world individually, we can make change by being compassionate to everyone in our community as a start. Every one of us in this community has decided at some point or other that we do not like someone in this community. And that's the truth. I know you may pretend like you like everybody, but there's a point in time where somebody in this community will annoy you. For me, it's Mr. Perney. Just kidding. I challenge you to look at the good in those people. I assure you that while we're all capable of evil, every one of us is also capable of good. Every one of us is beautiful yet ugly at the same time. I challenge you to look at the beauty in everyone. The person that you hate most is beloved by someone. Love is really acceptance of who people are, not what we want them to be and not who they were. I challenge you to truly love yourself and everyone else. Yes, there's glory in being better versions of ourselves, but I'm going to go back to the Buddhist concept of love. Getting to be a better version of yourself, as I've learned in many 40 years of life, is about first loving what I mean, accepting who you are right now. If we could all do that, the world would be a happier place. So I thank you for giving me the stage. You won't hear from me for a few years. Thank you.